It turns out gods do bleed as Dialga Arceus gets taken down a peg this week. Gallade has a breakout weekend, and Gyarados is rising back up in the metagame. Let's go ahead and dive on into our weekly meta report for Pokemon Pocket. Let's take a look at the starting metagame percentage of the largest tournaments this weekend, accounting for almost 2,000 competitors' deck lists. Dialga Arceus was 25% of the starting deck lists. Rampardos Lucario was 12.5%. 18 Trainer Misty variations were 5.5%. Gallade accounted for 5%. Gyarados Manaphy decks accounted for 4.5%. And double Palkia Manaphy decks accounted for 4%. If we do some week over week comparisons, we see all of the most popular decks from last week remained relatively stable in their starting metagame share this week. Dialga Arceus increased by 2% from 23 up to 25. Rampardos Lucario remained exactly the same at 12.5%. 18 Trainer Misty variations dropped off about 2%, and Manaphy Palkia remained exactly level at 4%. The big difference in our metagame this week is we had two new decks break onto the scene in meaningful metagame shares, with Gallade Hitmonlee variations and Gyarados Manaphy variations taking up 5 and 4.5% respectively of our starting metagame. To look at some performance metrics among our most popular decks, our almost 2,000 starting competitors turned into almost 170 deck lists that had a 70% or higher win rate in their respective tournaments. Comparing this starting distribution to our top performing distribution, we get the following results. Gallade Hitmonlee variations as well as Gyarados Manaphy have the strongest performance this week, which is likely why we see them crop up. Gallade in particular had a 190% increase between its starting metagame share of 5% and being 14.5% of our top performing deck list. Gyarados was not quite as impressive, but it did go from 4.5% up to 6%, or a 33% increase. Our third best performer among the popular decks this week, and the only other one to have a positive performance delta, is Rampardos Lucario, increasing by 16% between its 12.5% starting metagame share and its 14.5% of our top performers. Dialga Arceus, for the first time during the Triumphant Light metagame, has a small underperformance, with its starting 25% metagame share shrinking by 6% when it's only 23.5% of our top performers. Our non-Gyarados Misty decks have a really tough weekend, with the double Palkia Manaphy decks underperforming by 25% and the 18 Trainer Misty decks underperforming by nearly 50%. The metagame shifts we're seeing this week don't come as a surprise to me. Last week, when I did my tier list roundup, I called out Gallade, Gyarados, and Blastoise as 3 cards I felt were currently being undervalued in the metagame and could have breakout performances if the right deck lists were found. We're seeing 2 of the 3 of those be played in solid metagame shares this week to great success, and even the third Blastoise is actually going to be featured in a couple of deck lists that spiked individual results in tomorrow's new decks roundup in the morning. I also wasn't terribly surprised by the underperformers. Dialga Arceus, while definitely consistent and fairly powerful, has specific ways that we can attack it, like with Gyarados and Gallade. I also think the 18 Trainer Misty variations have been overrepresented in our first couple of weeks of the metagame, and as things are stabilizing and people are figuring things out, the one-dimensionality of these decks is ultimately one of its greatest weaknesses. Moving along to talking about some deck list specifics, let's kick things off with the Gallade Hitmonlee deck. That's our standout performer of the week. While some of the supporting trainer details in deck list does vary, essentially all of the top performing Gallade decks are playing these 9 Pokemon, with 2 copies of Hitmonlee and Marshadow supporting their powerful Stage 2 finisher. I think Hitmonlee, alongside the 2 copies of Cyrus, is an especially important call out into the format powerhouse of Arceus. Marking 30 damage on an Arceus that has a giant cape on it means you only need 2 energies on it in order to Cyrus it up and knock it out in 1 clean shot with Gallade before it's able to attack you back. Almost all of these Gallade deck lists are also playing 2 Rocky helmets as well, though, and I don't think this is a coincidence. Gallade notably has a very hefty 170 HP pool, meaning that it is always surviving the first hit from an Arceus when it's at full health. This means if you have a hat on your Gallade, when the Arceus comes up to the active spot, it's going to take 20 damage back, meaning even a cape can't save it from a fully charged Gallade hit while the Arceus has 3 energy on it. Looking at the matchup table for this Gallade deck, it's easy to see why it had such a breakout weekend. In hundreds of games played, it had an over 70% win rate against Dialga Arceus, the most popular deck in the metagame by a lot. It was approximately 50% into other fighting variations such as Rampardos Lucario, and it was winning more frequently than it was losing against the Gyarados deck that we're going to look at here in a minute, which was our other breakout performer this weekend. Moving along to our other breakout performer this week, Gyarados EX, featuring Origin Form Palkia and Manaphy as its supporting cast, we actually see a story very similar to the Gallade deck and likely why it's having a solid performance as well. In particular, Gyarados has a high HP pool, letting it survive a hit from an Arceus under most conditions, which when we pair with 2 copies of Rocky Helmet means that the 140 damage that Gyarados is dealing with its attack is going to be enough to clear an Arceus in one shot, even through a copy of Giant Cape. One thing that I thought was especially interesting inside of these deck lists as I was combing through the top performing ones is that a majority of them match the 20 cards that I have on your screen now, which notably do not include any copies of Misty. I will shout out that there were a handful that were playing Misty, giving up the Giovanni and the Pokemon communication to do so, but those were definitely the exception rather than the rule, with these cards on your screen right now being the most common configuration among the top performers. If I had to offer some speculation on why the Gyarados variation of the Manaphy Origin Form Palkia deck is performing better than the double Palkia build, I would wager it's because having a sustained high damage blast is a lot more potent in our current metagame than Palkia's one and done Dimensional Storm. In particular, against deck lists like Dialga Arceus that are going high HP EX into high HP EX, when you Dimensional Storm the first one away, you're going to have a hard time picking up a knockout on their second thing, especially if they have a Mew ready and waiting to go, ready to Dimensional Storm you back. Looking at the matchup tables for the Gyarados decks, it looks like it is a little bit favored into Dialga Arceus, winning about 55% of the time. It absolutely dominates the other water decks in the format, crushing the double Palkia Manaphy deck as well as 18 trainer Articuno. However, it's notable that it looks like it really struggles against both fighting variations, both Rampardos and Gallade. Moving along to looking at some trends in the most successful variations of other popular decks this week, we kick off with Dialga Arceus, where a noteworthy development is that 2 copies of Giovanni were being played in a number of the most successful builds of this archetype. Rampardos Lucario also remains largely the same, with the only distinct change being that a number have dropped down to just a singular copy of Sudowoodo, with many of them electing to play a copy of Hitmonchan in the stead of the second. I would wager this development is based on the fact that we're seeing Manaphy decks become more popular, and a Hitmonchan backed up by a Lucario can deal 50 to knock it out in one blow, while a Sudowoodo takes 2 turns, which when you factor in a copy of Irida is often not enough pressure fast enough to shut the water decks down. Manaphy Double Palkia and 18 Trainer Misty variations both failed to have any meaningful innovation this week, but here's the deck list on your screen as a point of reference. I'll be curious to see if these deck lists try to experiment a little bit next weekend when they get played again, because they both underperformed by a good margin by the numbers this week. Before we wrap things up today, I like to call it a couple more deck lists that are not being played in any meaningful metagame sample size, but have put up a handful of sporadic results for the second week in a row. The first of these is Berry Magnezone featuring Snorlax. One noted change is last week this deck list was being played with Shaman as its 5th basic to heal. This week a single copy of Marshadow, I assume paired with Fighting Energy, is being played as a way to leverage a quick damage burst after your opponent takes out one of your 140 HP heavy hitting leads. After playing a lot of Berry Snorlax myself, I have to say the combination is really growing on me. This card's ability to wall while also threatening to deal a large burst of damage with its supporter is a tough combination for a lot of things to get through, and this deck's 1-2 punch of lots of high HP single knockout point threats that deal triple digits worth of damage makes it a force to be reckoned with in a lot of its games. Finally, Executor EX Arceus spiked a handful of results again this week despite not having a meaningful starting metagame share. I really like this deck from an aggressive perspective. Executor EX remains one of the most powerful cards in the game when you're going first, letting you start cracking out an average of 60 damage per turn for just 1 energy, while giving you a hefty body, allowing you lots of time to set up your copy of Arceus behind it. Carnivine, while not as beefy as Executor, is just as aggressive when you have first energy advantage, letting you start to crack for 50 or occasionally even 60 when paired with a copy of Giovanni, pumping out massive amounts of damage while you get Arceus set up to go as your finisher behind it. I think our current Pokemon Pocket metagame is one of my personal favorites that we've had so far. While Dialga Arceus is definitely popular and powerful, our results from this weekend show that there are a number of meaningful ways to attack it. I would wager that there's some others still waiting to be discovered and optimized in this format that can do that as well. We're not seeing this metagame fully settle down, and I bet we'll probably see a couple more iterations while we wait for new cards to be coming, whenever that may be. If you enjoyed my very data-driven breakdown and roundup today, make sure you smash the like button on this video to help it reach some more people. If you're someone that happens to be new here and you enjoy thoughtful content like this, an off-meta deck roundup 7 days a week, I would love it if you'd subscribe and come back again. If you're speaking of off-meta decks, if you're looking for successful ones that have put up results in tournaments, you want to make sure you tune in for tomorrow morning's video as well, where I do my weekly roundup of the sweetest decks that spiked individual results that might be the next breakout things, such as the Gyarados and Gallade decks that had dominating performances this weekend. I really appreciate everyone that made it all the way to the end of this video, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.